The sun beat down hard on the deck of the Liberty ship as it cut through the Atlantic, bound for the east coast of the United States. Inside, the air buzzed not with dread, but with disbelief. Dr. Karl Reinhardt, a German military physician, sat on a bunk beside a porthole, staring out at the horizon. He wasn't shackled. He hadn't been yelled at or beaten. In fact, he'd just eaten a hot meal. Real meat, fresh vegetables, coffee. For a man who had expected to be treated like an enemy animal, it was the first of many shocks. In May of 1943, over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. Among them were hundreds of medical officers like Dr. Reinhardt. They had seen death up close, patched up shattered limbs in desert tents, and had been fed a steady diet of propaganda that told them what to expect. Cruelty, humiliation, and degradation in Allied hands. What they encountered instead was a contradiction too vast to comprehend. Karl wasn't naive. He had served long enough to know that war swallowed men whole, crushed their ideals, and turned them into shadows of themselves. But as his transport neared American shores, the uneasy feeling in his chest wasn't fear. It was confusion. Why were they being treated with such decency? When they docked in New York, Karl expected shouting, snarling guards, maybe a rifle butt to the ribs. Instead, American soldiers barked orders with professional detachment, and a military nurse handed him a water flask. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it was far from the hatred he had anticipated. They were quickly processed and sent to inland camps. Karl ended up in Texas, Camp Butner, a sprawling military installation built across 40,000 acres. As the desert sun baked the earth, he stepped off the truck and stared at the rows of tents and barracks. He had landed in the heart of the American military medical machine, and he was about to be pulled into a system that would both confound and challenge everything he thought he knew about medicine, ethics, and humanity. That first night, he sat on a cot under canvas, stretched taut against poles, listening to the chirp of crickets and the murmur of his fellow prisoners. Nearby, American guards chatted quietly. There were no screams, no punishments, no contempt. Only the strange weight of civility in a place meant for the vanquished. Karl's fingers traced the edge of a small booklet given to him upon arrival, a translated version of the Geneva Convention. Inside were rules, rights, provisions. He could hardly believe such a thing could exist in wartime. The Americans were not just following the law, they were exceeding it. He closed his eyes, trying to push down the unease growing in his chest. This wasn't the world he knew, and something told him that whatever came next would not be a prison sentence, but a reckoning. As the wind rattled the canvas above him, Karl realized something that would haunt and shape him for the rest of his life. He was not just a prisoner of war. He was about to become part of a story larger than himself, a story of unexpected dignity, of professional transformation, and of enemies becoming something far more complicated than foes. And it was only just beginning. Camp Butner stretched out like a miniature city on the Texas plains. Orderly rows of barracks, infirmaries, mess halls, and guard towers. It was designed to house tens of thousands of troops, but now its fences held the remnants of the defeated Afrika Korps. Doktor Karl Reinhardt, one of many medical officers among them, found the arrangement surreal. Each morning, he awoke to reveille not far different from the one he had known in his own army. But unlike the rigid brutality of his German superiors, the American guards ran the camp like an efficient hospital, not a prison. Karl had expected to be treated like a war criminal. Instead, he was addressed as doctor. He was assigned to the camp infirmary, where German prisoners with injuries or illnesses were treated. The real surprise came when he was introduced to an American counterpart, Captain James Marshall of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Marshall was younger than Karl, but his demeanor was sharp and respectful. He shook Karl's hand. "I understand you were stationed in Tripoli," Marshall asked. Karl nodded, still unsure if this was some ruse. "Yes, field hospital, mostly shrapnel wounds and gangrene. We've seen our share of that too. Perhaps we can learn from each other." That sentence struck Karl like a blow. Learn from each other. Was this officer serious? A German prisoner, a defeated enemy, being invited into professional exchange. Within days, Karl found himself participating in medical rounds, consulting on cases involving both German prisoners and American wounded. The camp's hospital was better equipped than many facilities Karl had seen in Germany before the war. Surgical tools were sterilized in modern autoclaves. There were plentiful antibiotics, sulfur drugs, and even penicillin, a substance that still sounded like science fiction to most German physicians. The American nurses surprised him most. These women were respected members of the medical team, performing procedures Karl had believed were reserved for physicians. Their calm authority, their confidence, and their technical knowledge all challenged his preconceptions. In Germany, such responsibilities would never have been granted to women. One day, while assisting in a surgical procedure to remove shrapnel from a German soldier's thigh, Karl watched as a young American nurse handled the anesthesia with precision. Her name was Susan Franklin, and she barely acknowledged his presence until the surgery was complete. "You held the retractor wrong," she said flatly. Karl bristled. "I've done dozens of these." "I believe you," she replied, "but we do it differently here. If you're going to assist, you'll need to adapt." The comment stung, but later that night, as he reviewed American surgical textbooks borrowed from the camp library, Karl realized she was right. And more importantly, her correction wasn't laced with superiority, it was simply professional. That was the theme that repeated itself in the weeks that followed. Professionalism. Not kindness, not forgiveness, but respect based on shared expertise. American doctors didn't see Karl as a threat. They saw him as a fellow physician, a man bound by the same oath, despite the uniform he had once worn. Each time Karl was asked for his opinion, consulted on a difficult diagnosis, or invited to observe an American-led operation, something shifted inside him. He was still a prisoner. But in the sterile white halls of the infirmary, he wasn't treated as one. He was treated as a doctor. It was not what he had been told to expect. It was not what his country had prepared him for. And as the weeks turned into months, Karl began to question. If this was how America treated its enemies, what did that say about the war they were fighting, and the one he had served? Autumn rolled slowly across the Texan landscape, turning the heat into a dry breeze that swept through Camp Butner. For Dr. Karl Reinhardt, the passing of time no longer felt like a prison sentence, but a strange immersion into another world, a world that operated on principles he was only beginning to understand. In the camp infirmary, life moved with steady urgency. Each day brought new cases, appendicitis, broken limbs from work accidents, infections. But what fascinated Karl most wasn't the medicine itself. It was the way American doctors and nurses approached the work, not with detachment, but with quiet commitment to healing, even for their enemies. He had begun to shadow Captain Marshall regularly, joining him on hospital rounds. One morning, they were called to examine a young American soldier recovering from surgery. As they approached the bedside, the soldier narrowed his eyes at Karl. "He's German," the boy muttered. "Why's he here?" Marshall didn't flinch. "He's a doctor, a good one, and he's here to help." Karl said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. He had grown used to the suspicion, but it never quite stopped stinging. And yet, in that moment, something shifted. The soldier didn't argue. He just nodded and looked away. Later that evening, Karl sat in the camp's modest library. It was stocked with books donated by civilians and universities, including several medical journals. He flipped through a volume of the Journal of the American Medical Association, absorbing techniques and studies he had never seen before. In Germany, such literature had been filtered, censored, distorted. Here it was freely available, even to him. One article on anesthesia techniques fascinated him. He copied the notes meticulously into a small, worn notebook he had kept since North Africa. Nearby, other German doctors did the same, reading, translating, discussing. In the dim light of the library, they weren't prisoners. They were students again. A few weeks later, Karl was asked to assist in a more complex operation, an abdominal surgery on an American corporal injured in a training accident. The American lead surgeon, Dr. Leslie Granger, had heard of Karl's skills. "We could use your hands," he said simply. The procedure was long, meticulous. At one point, the bleeding became critical. Karl instinctively took over suturing the vessel, his hand steady, his focus absolute. When the operation was over, Granger clapped him on the shoulder. "Nice work, doctor. That boy lives because of you." Karl didn't know what to say. The American staff cleared out of the room, leaving him alone in the sterile quiet. He leaned against the wall, his knees suddenly weak. This wasn't just medicine. This was something deeper, trust. That night in the barracks, he lay awake. He thought of the wounded Allied soldiers he had treated, the medical supplies he had access to, the conversations with American nurses and physicians who spoke to him as if he were one of them. It was disorienting, it was humbling, and it was also profoundly humanizing. In the face of war's brutality, here was something else, a quiet affirmation that beneath the uniforms they were all bound by the same duty. But a question lingered, dark and insistent. How long could this fragile bridge of respect hold in a world still ripping itself apart? And what would become of it once the war was over? He closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring more patience, more challenges, and perhaps more understanding. The war might have defined the world outside the camp, but inside its fences, something unexpected was beginning to take root. By the winter of 1943, Camp Butner had transformed into more than just a holding facility. It had become, for some, a strange kind of campus. An unlikely space for learning, reflection, and reluctant camaraderie. For Dr. Karl Reinhardt, every day inside those fences blurred the lines between captivity and opportunity. The medical ward had grown busy. Flu season had arrived, and with it the challenges of managing illness among thousands of prisoners living in close quarters. Karl found himself working alongside American staff to organize immunization campaigns and educate fellow prisoners on sanitation practices. Posters in German and English lined the barracks, encouraging hand-washing and reporting symptoms early. But what struck him most was the collaboration. American medical officers didn't bark orders, they asked questions. Nurses conferred with German doctors. Decisions were made together. Even in small things, how to handle fevers, distribute medications, or isolate sick men, there was shared responsibility. One afternoon, Karl was invited to a meeting with Captain Marshall and a civilian consultant from Duke University. The topic? Using German medical personnel to assist with non-critical patient care in local hospitals. It was controversial. Not everyone trusted former enemy officers to work outside the wire. "I know what you're thinking," the consultant said, "but we're short-staffed, and you've proven yourselves more than capable." Karl looked around the table. The offer was astonishing. Prisoners of war being asked to help civilians. In Nazi Germany, the idea would have been laughable. Here, it was just practical. Eventually, a group of German prisoners, including Karl, was cleared to assist as non-clinical aides in nearby facilities. Their roles were carefully restricted: orderlies, mess attendants, sanitation teams, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The war still raged in Europe, but here in North Carolina, former enemies were patching up the wounded side by side. In one hospital, Karl encountered a young American nurse who eyed him warily as he wiped down equipment in the surgical prep room. "My grandfather died fighting the Kaiser's army," she said without preamble. Karl paused, then nodded. "Mine died in the trenches at Verdun." Silence passed between them. Then she looked down at her clipboard. "Well, at least we've learned to clean better since then." He smiled. So did she. It wasn't friendship, but it was something. Back at the camp, word spread of the assignments. Some prisoners bristled. They saw the work as capitulation. Others, especially the doctors, understood the greater implications. This wasn't about surrender, it was about relevance, about retaining a sense of purpose. In the evenings, Karl returned to his cot with aching feet and a mind buzzing with new techniques and approaches he had seen in American facilities. He began writing long notes, sketches of hospital layouts, inventory systems, patient charts. He wasn't just surviving captivity, he was preparing for what might come after. And yet, amid the growing sense of dignity and usefulness, a darker truth lingered. The radio reports filtered into the camp told of German cities flattened by Allied bombs, of millions displaced, of a Reich in retreat. The Germany he might one day return to was collapsing. Each night, as he scribbled under the flicker of a bare bulb, Karl wondered whether any of this knowledge would matter when he went home. Would there be hospitals left to return to? Would there be patients? Would there even be a future for men like him, shaped by one world, transformed by another? The answers would not come easily, but for now his hands stayed busy, his mind stayed sharp, and in the quiet corners of an enemy camp, the seeds of something unexpected, respect, renewal, perhaps even hope, continued to grow. Spring arrived in Texas with a quiet intensity. The dry winds softened, wildflowers broke through the scrub, and Camp Butner's dusty roads took on a strange beauty. For Dr. Karl Reinhardt, the changing season mirrored the quiet transformation happening inside himself and among many of the men around him. By now, he had earned something rare among the Americans: trust. He was routinely consulted on difficult medical cases. His opinions, once met with cautious silence, were now sought with respect. And perhaps most surprising of all, he found himself mentoring young American medics in battlefield wound management, techniques he had honed under relentless shelling in North Africa. It was during one of these impromptu teaching sessions, demonstrating a rapid field dressing technique to a group of recruits, that Captain Marshall pulled him aside. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said. He led Karl to a visiting physician, Dr. Harold Whitman, a professor of surgery from the University of North Carolina. Whitman was inspecting the camp's medical operations on behalf of a military academic liaison program. The goal, to assess whether German medical personnel might contribute to medical training efforts stateside. Karl was stunned. The idea that he, a prisoner of war, might be invited to share his knowledge in a formal academic setting was unthinkable. Whitman listened carefully as Karl described battlefield triage under fire, improvised sterilization in sand-blasted tents, and the emotional toll of treating soldiers whose wounds went beyond the physical. When he finished, Whitman nodded. "You've seen things we haven't. That makes your experience valuable. War has many teachers." That evening, Karl sat under a mesquite tree near the camp fence, watching the horizon fade into twilight. He felt the ache of homesickness. Germany was far away, and the news from home grew worse by the week. Cities in rubble, hospitals destroyed, colleagues dead or missing. But in his lap was a new medical journal, freshly printed, shipped from New York, and filled with studies on wound care, infectious disease, and surgical innovation. He devoured every page. What struck him most wasn't the science, it was the spirit. There was an openness in American medicine that fascinated him. Mistakes were admitted, experiments were shared. Collaboration was encouraged. In Germany, knowledge had become secretive, rigid, often politicized. Here, it was something to be built together. He began writing letters he couldn't send, notes addressed to former colleagues, to his medical school dean, even to the hospital director he had served under in Munich. In those letters, he detailed what he had learned, not just techniques and tools, but principles. Fair treatment, equal care for enemy and ally, the refusal to weaponize medicine. These were lessons born not of textbooks, but of experience, in a country he had been taught to hate, among people he had been trained to fear. And yet, not everyone welcomed this quiet transformation. Some German prisoners accused him of betrayal. One evening, as he left the infirmary, someone had scrawled on the side of the barracks in chalk, "Arzt der Amerikaner," Doctor of the Americans. He stood there staring at the words. Then, without a word, he picked up a cloth, wiped the chalk away, and went back to his bunk. He knew who he was, and as the camp around him settled into sleep, Karl realized something else. This war would not define him. But how he practiced medicine, regardless of borders or uniforms, just might. The summer heat returned with a vengeance. Texas sun bore down on Camp Butner's metal rooftops, turning the interiors into ovens by midday. But inside the camp infirmary, fans hummed, nurses worked with rolled sleeves, and the work never stopped. Dr. Karl Reinhardt wiped sweat from his brow as he examined the X-rays of a young German prisoner who had fractured his clavicle during a work detail. What caught Karl's eye wasn't the break, it was the quality of the film. Sharp, clear. American X-ray equipment was far superior to anything he had used in Germany. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of envy, but also curiosity. How had they achieved such consistency in imaging? What were their safety protocols? How did they manage radiation exposure? That afternoon, he asked to visit the camp's radiology department. Surprisingly, permission was granted. There, he met Lieutenant Anna Morris, a radiologic technician who explained the operation with professionalism and patience. "We track dosage exposure," she said, pointing to a clipboard. "Each tech wears a badge that's checked weekly. No guessing here, safety's non-negotiable." Karl was stunned. In German military hospitals, they had operated X-ray machines with worn-out manuals and aging tubes. Radiation safety was barely understood, much less enforced. What he saw here wasn't just advanced, it was methodical. Over the next few weeks, Karl began assisting in the radiology ward. He took notes, asked questions, and studied American practices in patient positioning, calibration, and safety checks. The more he saw, the more he realized how far behind Germany had fallen in its medical infrastructure. One evening, back in his barracks, he shared his observations with a fellow prisoner, Dr. Hans Weitz, a former radiologist from Frankfurt. "They've got systems for everything," Karl said. "Inventory, maintenance, staff safety, it's all documented." Weitz nodded solemnly. "We lost too much chasing ideology. They focused on function." Karl couldn't disagree. In America, the war had certainly left its scars, but the medical system had not been hollowed out by politics. Here, a good idea wasn't ignored because of who proposed it. Innovation wasn't stifled. And above all, medicine wasn't propaganda, it was practice. At Camp Butner, the influence of academic institutions continued to grow. German medical personnel were granted supervised access to university libraries through coordinated efforts with Duke and the University of North Carolina. Once a week, Karl and a small group of doctors were escorted to review materials or attend seminars. Seated in the back, never addressed directly, but allowed to listen. The experience was surreal. There he sat, in uniform marked with a prisoner's patch, listening to American professors lecture on penicillin's mechanisms, post-operative infection control, and psychiatric care for returning soldiers. Karl took notes furiously. Every fact, every technique, every observation was fuel for the world he hoped to help rebuild. But the contrast to his homeland was crushing. Reports from Europe spoke of typhus outbreaks, hospital bombings, supply shortages. His own city, Munich, had been bombed. The university hospital was gone. One night, Karl wrote in his journal, "They treat their wounded with dignity, even us. We who came here in defeat now learn from them how to heal. What irony! What grace!" That entry ended abruptly, a single tear smudging the ink. He closed the notebook, staring into the darkened barracks. Around him, men slept restlessly. Dreams of home were mixed with the fear of what that home had become. In the stillness, Karl made himself a quiet vow. If he ever returned, he would not return as the man who left. He would return as a doctor reborn, not by war, but by what he had witnessed in the unlikeliest of places, a prisoner camp turned classroom. The days blended into one another, punctuated only by the rhythm of medical rounds, training sessions, and the occasional radio bulletin from the front lines. Dr. Karl Reinhardt had long stopped counting the months since his capture. His world had narrowed to the boundaries of Camp Butner, but within those boundaries his identity had widened. He was still a prisoner, yes, but more than that, he had become a bridge, a translator of medicine, ethics, and culture between two worlds at war. One morning, a new assignment came down. Karl was to oversee the dental hygiene program in the German compound, working with a small team of American dentists and German dental officers. It was a detail most would have declined, but Karl accepted. He understood the deeper meaning behind it. In Germany, dental care in the military had been reactive: pain, infection, extraction. Preventive care was rare. But here, even among prisoners, oral health was taken seriously. There were regular cleanings, cavity prevention campaigns, and detailed patient logs. At first, some prisoners mocked the effort. "What does it matter if our teeth are clean when our cities burn?" one man sneered. Karl didn't argue. He simply kept working, encouraging patients to attend checkups, translating medical terms for the German staff, and ensuring proper sterilization procedures. Over time, even the skeptics stopped complaining. A toothache, after all, doesn't care who wins a war. In the dental office, he observed something else: how American nurses and hygienists interacted with patients. They smiled, they asked questions, they explained procedures. It was a level of patient communication rarely seen in his homeland, where medical hierarchy often created distance. One afternoon, Carl sat with an American dentist named Lieutenant Paul Simmons as they examined equipment inventory. "You keep meticulous records," Carl noted. "Have to," Simmons replied. "Inventory, maintenance, patient notes, it's all part of continuity. We treat the person, not just the problem." That phrase stuck with Carl. Treat the person. It sounded simple, but it carried a weight that challenged his training. In wartime Germany, medicine had become utilitarian. Efficiency over empathy. Here, even in a prisoner camp, it was different. Later that week, Carl was asked to assist in a public health lecture given by an American officer. The topic, disease prevention in closed environments. The lecture was translated for the German population, with Carl offering additional explanations. Afterward, a young German medical assistant approached him. "You really believe in all this? American methods?" Carl paused, then said quietly, "I believe in anything that keeps men alive. That eases suffering. The flag above it doesn't matter." Word of his involvement in these programs spread. Some prisoners began to look to him not just as a doctor, but as a leader, a man navigating the strange terrain between past and future, pride and pragmatism. But not all were supportive. Late one night, someone slipped a folded note under his pillow. It read in rough handwriting, "Traitor in a white coat." Carl read it, folded it again, and burned it in a tin can behind the barracks. The next morning, he reported to duty as always, clipboard in hand, heart steady. He had made his choice, not for America, not against Germany, but for medicine, for humanity. As the war outside dragged on with fury and chaos, inside Camp Butner, Carl was part of something slower, quieter, and perhaps more enduring. A healing not just of bodies, but of conscience. And in that fragile space between enemy lines, a new kind of loyalty was taking root. By early 1945, the mood in Camp Butner had shifted. Rumors of Germany's collapse filled the air. The news from Europe was no longer about battles won or lost. It was about cities turned to ash, millions displaced, a country unraveling from the inside. For Dr. Karl Reinhardt, every headline was a thread cut loose from the homeland he barely recognized anymore. But even as the world outside grew darker, inside the camp a strange kind of illumination continued. That spring, Karl was invited to assist with a rehabilitation initiative for wounded soldiers, both Allied and German. The program emphasized physical therapy, vocational retraining, and psychological support. A radical departure from the way his homeland viewed the wounded. Back in Germany, a soldier who couldn't return to the front was often forgotten. Here he was prepared for a life beyond war. The rehabilitation unit was staffed by a multidisciplinary team: doctors, nurses, physical therapists, and even social workers. Carl had never worked in such an integrated setting. He found himself learning just as much about therapy bands and mobility exercises as he did about the human spirit. He was assigned to a young American sergeant recovering from a severe leg wound. The man, initially cold, soon warmed to Carl's patience and quiet humor. "You're not what I expected from a Nazi doctor," the sergeant said one afternoon. "I'm not what I expected either," Carl replied with a faint smile. In those daily sessions, stretching muscles, massaging scar tissue, encouraging each faltering step, a strange truth emerged. Healing knew no nationality. But not all wounds were visible. Carl's work in the mental health ward opened doors he hadn't expected. The Americans called it combat fatigue. In Germany, such men were called cowards. Here they were treated with compassion. He watched psychiatrists use talk therapy, occupational assignments, even music to ease the minds of broken soldiers. It challenged everything he had been taught. War, he realized, wounded the psyche just as cruelly as the body. One night, he sat in the ward's common room as a patient played the piano. Halting, haunted notes drifting through the air. The tune was familiar, Beethoven. Carl closed his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't a prisoner, wasn't a doctor. He was simply a man mourning a world gone mad. Afterward, he spoke with the attending psychiatrist, a graying woman named Evelyn Hart. "In Germany," he said quietly, "we punished men who broke." Dr. Hart nodded, her gaze steady. "That's not medicine, that's cruelty." Her words landed hard, but they also freed something inside him. For the first time, Karl saw that medicine wasn't just about saving lives, it was about honoring the person behind the pain. Back in the barracks, he updated his journal, now thick with pages. He wrote about everything: the techniques, the ethics, the moments of unexpected grace. But this entry was different. They treat the mind as gently as the body, he wrote. They ask not just what broke, but why, and how to mend it. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. A summer storm was rolling in, washing the Texas air with cool wind and the scent of rain. Inside, Karl felt a storm of his own. Questions, regrets, realizations. He had come to this place expecting chains. What he found was a mirror. The war was ending. But what it had begun inside him was only now taking shape. And as the lightning cracked across the sky, he knew the real reckoning was still to come. The news came in late April. Hitler was dead. Germany was in ruins. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. In Camp Butner, the announcement landed like a bomb made of silence. No cheering, no cries, just an eerie stillness. For Dr. Karl Reinhardt, the words echoed through his chest like a final heartbeat of the country he once knew. 1,000 memories, family, colleagues, lectures in grand halls, surgeries under candlelight, now belonged to a nation that no longer existed. Some prisoners wept openly, others sat in stunned disbelief. A few celebrated quietly, relieved that at last the bloodshed might end. But Karl felt only emptiness. He walked the perimeter that evening, hands behind his back, eyes fixed on the dusty road. Behind him, men spoke in hushed tones of going home. What might be left? Who might be alive? But for Karl, home had become an abstraction. He had left one Germany and would return to another. The following weeks were a blur of logistical preparations. Repatriation had begun, medical evaluations, debriefings, transportation schedules. Karl was assigned to assist with final health checks for outgoing prisoners. It was strange, examining the same men he had bunked beside, stitched up, argued with, now handing them a clean bill of health so they could return to the ashes. One afternoon, he conducted an exam with an American physician for a fellow German doctor who had lost an eye in North Africa. As they reviewed the man's records, the American said softly, "You've done good work here, Reinhardt. Just thought you should know." Karl didn't answer. He simply nodded and closed the file. His own repatriation date approached. He began packing the few belongings he had: a stack of journals, 2 American medical textbooks, a worn stethoscope gifted by a nurse who once called him her quiet teacher, and a folded American flag that had been ceremoniously presented to the medical unit. Its gesture never explained, its meaning deeply felt. Before leaving, he visited the infirmary one last time. He walked through the halls, touching the backs of chairs, the cool edge of the operating table. The shelf where antibiotics were lined with care. Each corner held a lesson, each object a memory. At the nurse's station, he left a sealed envelope addressed to Captain Marshall. Inside, he had written, "You gave me back my profession, not by forgiving me, but by allowing me to practice again with dignity. I return to my country a changed man, and it is because you treated me not as a prisoner, but as a colleague." The final bus ride out of Camp Butner was quiet. A few men sang low songs. Others stared out the windows, trying to memorize the American landscape, so foreign, yet now oddly familiar. As they crossed the camp gates, Karl looked back once. The watchtower stood still. The sun glinted off the infirmary windows. A place built to hold enemies had somehow become a place of healing. They were shipped to New York, then onto repatriation ships. The docks were crowded with returning prisoners, Red Cross workers, and uniformed guards. The ship Karl boarded was packed, but orderly. He stood at the railing as the American coast receded into mist. He wasn't sure what waited for him across the ocean, but he knew what he carried with him. A new code of conduct, a deeper understanding of medicine, and the strange gift of grace offered by those he once called the enemy. The war had taken everything, and yet, in the quiet corridors of a camp hospital, something had been restored. His journey was far from over. But his compass now pointed not to ideology, but to healing, and for the first time in years that felt like enough. Germany was no longer the country Dr. Karl Reinhardt had left. The ship docked at a war-ravaged port, and as he stepped onto the cracked pavement, a wind carrying ash and unfamiliar silence met him. Buildings were hollowed out, streets scattered with debris, and faces wore a thin film of exhaustion that no sleep could wash away. Karl made his way to Munich by train, what was left of the train system at least. The journey was slow and somber. Fellow returnees sat in silence, some clutching photographs, others staring into nothing. There was no welcome party, no cheering crowd, only the slow realization that their homeland had been hollowed out, not just in bricks, but in spirit. His old hospital had been reduced to rubble. The university library, once the pride of Bavaria, was now a shell filled with charred paper. His childhood home, miraculously still standing, was occupied by a displaced family. He did not ask them to leave. Instead, Karl moved into a small room offered by an old colleague, one of the few doctors still practicing in the city. Within days, he was back in a clinic. What passed for one, anyway. Patients lined the hallways, supplies were minimal, and morale was even lower. It was a place of desperation, not healing. But Karl brought something with him others did not. He brought notebooks filled with observations, procedures, and protocols learned during his time in America. He brought knowledge of sterilization methods, trauma care techniques, rehabilitation models, and even early psychiatric interventions for war survivors. Most of all, he brought perspective. When he recommended using sulfur drugs liberally, his peers balked. When he suggested a structured patient intake system, they waved him off. But slowly, one patient at a time, his methods began to speak louder than his past. He took on younger medical apprentices, men and women who had survived the war but had lost years of education. With no formal school available, he converted a basement into a classroom. Using salvaged equipment, he demonstrated American surgical techniques. Using torn textbooks, he taught ethics, not as a theory but as something he had seen lived in real time. One day, a visiting medical administrator from Berlin sat in on one of his classes. Afterward, she asked, "Where did you learn all this?" Karl hesitated, then answered simply, "As a prisoner." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps captivity taught you what freedom did not." In the evenings, Karl would walk the quiet streets of Munich, now barely lit, still aching with loss. He would think of Camp Butner, the sterile hallways, the respectful nods, the quiet confidence of American nurses. He missed it, not because it was easy, but because it had reminded him who he could be. Letters began arriving, some from former camp colleagues, both German and American. One was from Captain Marshall, brief but personal. "Know this, what you brought home is more than skill. It's the proof that healing is possible, even between enemies." Karl kept that letter folded in his coat pocket. It was a talisman against the cynicism he often saw creeping into post-war medicine. As the clinic grew, so did his influence. Other doctors began adopting his methods. The basement school became a network. Former prisoners who had studied with him passed on what they had learned. And so, from the ruins of war, a quiet revolution in care began to take shape. But Karl never saw himself as a pioneer. He saw himself simply as a man who had been given another chance. By strangers, in another language, behind a fence. And he intended to make that chance matter. In the years that followed, Dr. Karl Reinhardt's reputation grew steadily, though he never sought the spotlight. He preferred the back rooms of clinics, the basement classrooms, and the humble lecture halls cobbled together in war-ravaged buildings. But his ideas, rooted in what he had seen and learned in captivity, began to reshape the culture of medicine in post-war Germany. One of his most radical proposals at the time was simple. Treat every patient, regardless of background, with equal care and dignity. It was a concept embedded deeply in American military medicine, but it met resistance in his homeland, where hierarchy and judgment had long dominated the system. Still, change took root, slowly. Karl trained nurses to take on more authority, encouraging them to speak up during rounds and collaborate on patient care. He opened dialogues about mental health, drawing directly from the therapies he had witnessed in Camp Butner. He even pushed for standardizing medical record-keeping based on American models, arguing that clear documentation could save as many lives as a scalpel. But it was in the medical school that his legacy truly began. By 1950, he had been asked to teach part-time, at the reconstituted Munich University medical program. His lectures weren't charismatic, but they were grounded, honest, and filled with hard-won truth. Students respected him not for his war stories, he rarely shared them, but for the way he emphasized the patient above all. He told them again and again, "Our duty is not to country, not to politics, but to the human being lying in that bed." Some colleagues found him difficult to work with, too stubborn, too idealistic. But others, especially the younger generation, saw him as a guiding light. They began calling him quietly among themselves, "the doctor who came back changed." Karl didn't mind the label, it was true. One of his proudest moments came unexpectedly. A former American nurse, Susan Franklin, now working with an international aid group, visited Germany for a post-war health initiative. They met again in a temporary clinic outside Berlin. "I heard your name on a referral list," she said, extending her hand with a surprised smile. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Karl took her hand, humbled. "You were the first to teach me that medicine could be more than survival." They worked side by side for several days, coordinating care for displaced families. It felt, in many ways, like those days in the camp. Except now, there were no fences. Before she left, Susan handed him a package. Inside was a worn medical guidebook, one Karl had used often at Camp Butner. She had kept it. "I thought it belonged to you," she said. He nodded, overwhelmed. "It helped me find my way." As she walked away, Karl stood watching her figure disappear into the dust. She had been a stranger once, an enemy. Now she was a reminder of how thin that line had been all along. Back in Munich, Karl placed the book on a shelf above his desk. Around it were journals, teaching manuals, and his old wartime notebooks, faded but filled with knowledge that no bomb could destroy. He knew he would never be famous. There would be no statues, no grand awards. But he also knew that somewhere out there, dozens, maybe hundreds of doctors, nurses, and caregivers were practicing a better kind of medicine because of what he had carried home. And in the quiet of his study, as he prepared another lesson plan, Karl Reinhardt smiled softly. He had once been a prisoner of war. Now he was simply a doctor again. The rebuilding of post-war Germany was chaotic, painful, and slow. But amid the debris, institutions began to rise again. Schools, hospitals, community centers, and quietly, behind many of those efforts in Munich's medical community, was Dr. Karl Reinhardt. He had become an advisor on medical curriculum reform, bringing with him a proposal inspired by his experience in American captivity. Integrate practical clinical experience from the very first year of training. In pre-war Germany, students had studied theory for years before ever seeing a patient. Karl argued for a more hands-on approach. It was met with skepticism. "Students aren't ready," one senior professor said. "They'll make mistakes." "They will," Karl replied, "but under supervision, they will learn from those mistakes. That's how doctors are made. That's how they become human." Eventually, a pilot program was approved. Small groups of students began shadowing doctors in outpatient clinics. They sat in on consultations, assisted in simple procedures, and learned to listen before they diagnosed. Karl observed every session with quiet intensity. He pushed students to ask not just what, but why. He asked them to reflect on what they saw, not only physically but emotionally. Was the patient anxious? Did they trust the physician? Was the treatment plan explained clearly? One day a student asked, "Why does this matter so much to you?" Karl paused. "Because I've seen what happens when medicine becomes a machine, and I've seen what it can become when it's an act of compassion." That semester, dropout rates fell, patient satisfaction increased, word spread. Other universities began to inquire about Karl's methods. In 1953, he was invited to speak at a European medical ethics conference in Geneva. It was his first time leaving Germany since the war. There, he presented a quiet but powerful thesis: that medicine should be rooted in dignity, communication, and cross-border collaboration. He told the audience, "During my captivity, I learned more about the soul of medicine than I had in years of textbooks. I was treated not as a prisoner, but as a colleague, and that changed everything." Afterward, several attendees approached him, not with questions, but with gratitude. One Swiss doctor said, "You've given us hope that from this war something good can still grow." Returning home, Karl resumed his work with renewed purpose. He continued to mentor young doctors, many of whom came from families that had suffered in the war. He never asked them where they stood politically, only whether they were ready to serve with integrity. At night, he often sat by his window with a cup of tea, staring out over the city. The skyline was different now, modern towers mixing with old stone. New Germany, still haunted by its past, was forging a new path. He hoped medicine would lead by example. His health began to falter in his late 50s. The years of stress, hard labor in Africa, and emotional strain had taken their toll. But he kept teaching, kept writing. He declined formal honors, preferring instead to see his students succeed. In a letter to a former American colleague, Dr. James Marshall, now retired, Karl wrote, "Perhaps war taught us what peace never could, that beneath the uniform, the accent, even the flag, we are all bound by a deeper oath, not to serve nations, but to serve life itself." He signed it simply, "Your colleague, always, Karl." He never received a reply. But in his heart, he knew the message had landed. And as the city lights flickered against the dark Bavarian sky, Karl felt something rare and quiet, contentment. Not for what had been lost, but for what had been salvaged. By the time the 1960s arrived, the world had moved on, at least on the surface. A new generation of doctors was coming of age, many born after the war, eager and idealistic. They knew little of ration cards, bomb raids, or life behind barbed wire. Dr. Karl Reinhardt, now graying and slowed by arthritis, watched them with a quiet mix of pride and worry. He still taught occasional classes, now more focused on medical ethics than procedures. His voice was softer, his pace slower, but when he spoke, the room fell silent. Because what Karl offered wasn't just theory, it was truth earned through survival. He had begun compiling his writings into a manuscript, a personal and professional account of his years as a physician before, during, and after the war. He called it The Other War, Medicine Beyond the Front. The manuscript wasn't sensational. There were no battlefield heroics. Instead, it focused on the moments that had haunted and shaped him. The dying child in Tripoli, the American nurse who corrected him without disdain, the look in a fellow prisoner's eyes when he was called doctor instead of Kraut. A small academic press agreed to publish it. The initial print was modest, but the response was unexpectedly strong. Letters came from medical students, professors, even survivors of POW camps. One letter came from a young American doctor stationed in West Germany as part of a NATO medical unit. "I found your book in a military library," it read. "Your story reminded me why I went into medicine, not for prestige, but for the chance to care, to listen, to heal. Thank you." Karl folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the others he had saved. He didn't respond to them all, but he read each one. They reminded him that legacy didn't always wear medals. It often traveled quietly, in words and in the hands of those who remembered. In the fall of 1963, Karl received an invitation to speak at an international conference on medical humanitarianism in Geneva. It was to be his final public appearance. When he stepped to the podium, the room hushed. He wore a simple suit, no awards or titles pinned to his chest. Just a doctor, carrying memory. He began with a story of a prisoner transported not in cattle cars but in passenger trains, of being served hot meals on a ship bound for the land of his enemy, of being called by his title, not his number. "I was not spared pain," he told them, "but I was spared humiliation, and that, I believe, was what allowed me to remain a doctor, even when everything else had been stripped away." He spoke of ethics, of dignity, of how American military medicine had honored the Geneva Convention not just in rule, but in spirit, and how that spirit had shaped a new vision of medicine for post-war Germany. He closed with a challenge to the audience. Let us not teach students merely how to treat diseases. Let us teach them how to treat people, especially when the world tells them not to. The room erupted in quiet, heartfelt applause. Some stood, others simply wiped their eyes. Karl stepped down from the stage, heart full, body tired. He had said what he needed to say. Back in Munich, he returned to his quiet life. He declined further speaking requests. He continued to meet with students one-on-one, always offering the same question at the end of their visits. What kind of doctor do you want to be when no one is watching? It was the question that had once saved him, and now it was the one he passed on, like a torch held out in the dark. The final winter of Dr. Karl Reinhardt's life came quietly. Snow blanketed Munich's rooftops, muffling the world outside his apartment. He no longer walked far, but visitors were frequent, former students, colleagues, even an occasional American diplomat who had heard of the doctor who learned behind the wire. His health declined slowly but steadily. Congestive heart failure, the doctors said. He understood the prognosis better than anyone, but he faced it with the same calm he had brought into every ward and every classroom. He didn't fear death. What he feared was leaving his work unfinished. He spent his final months compiling one last set of lectures, notes, diagrams, personal reflections, into a collection titled Medicine Without Borders, A Life Between Nations. It wasn't meant for publication, just a gift to the university's archives and to his most devoted students. One of them, a young woman named Lena Weiss, often visited to read aloud from his notes. She was sharp, idealistic, and curious, reminding Karl of who he had once been. One evening, as she prepared to leave, she asked, "Do you regret it, staying here, not returning to America?" Karl looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said softly. "I needed to bring what I learned back here. That was the point." She nodded, understanding. They both knew that legacies weren't measured in places, but in what you left behind. On a cold February morning in 1964, Karl Reinhardt passed away in his sleep. No fanfare, no final words, just a quiet ending to a life that had once stood on both sides of a war and chosen healing. His funeral was modest but deeply attended. Nurses wept. Former POWs stood in silence. A small bouquet was sent from the U.S. Army Medical Corps. The card read, "To a fellow physician in life and beyond." The university lowered its flag to half-mast. At the next faculty meeting, a moment of silence was held, not just for a teacher, but for a man who had lived his ethics. In the years that followed, his teachings continued to ripple outward. Medical schools across Germany adopted more human-centered training models. Cross-cultural exchange programs flourished. And in Camp Butner, now long closed, an exhibit was erected in a local museum. Enemies in uniform, colleagues in practice. Karl's name was listed on a plaque beside faded photographs and medical journals. Lena Weiss went on to become a prominent physician and professor herself. She often quoted her mentor's quiet mantra, "Treat the person, not the passport." Sometimes she would tell her students about the old man who had sat at his desk with trembling hands, still editing lecture notes, still trying to teach something greater than medicine itself. And somewhere in an old wooden cabinet in the university archives, bound in cracked leather, sat the journal of Dr. Karl Reinhardt, the notebook he had carried from the sands of North Africa to a prisoner's tent in Texas, and finally home again. Its final line, written in faded ink, read, "In war I lost my nation. In medicine I found my humanity." Decades have passed since Dr. Karl Reinhardt walked the corridors of Camp Butner or taught in the rebuilt lecture halls of post-war Munich. But his story, quiet, resilient, and deeply human, has endured in ways even he could never have predicted. In modern Germany, his name occasionally appears in ethics seminars and textbooks on medical history. In the United States, a copy of his handwritten journal remains preserved at a military medical museum, alongside the faded uniforms of men once called enemies. But perhaps the truest legacy lives not in exhibits or citations, but in the ethos he carried and passed on. That dignity, once given, has the power to reshape a life. The war that once consumed the world created unimaginable destruction. It tore families apart, razed cities, and left scars that no medicine could fully heal. And yet, even in the midst of that devastation, it also revealed what is most enduring in the human spirit. Karl's journey from battlefield surgeon to prisoner, and finally to healer of a broken system, is not simply a tale of survival. It is a testament to the power of professional respect, of ethical conviction, and of unexpected grace. His time in captivity did not crush him, it refined him, because someone, somewhere, chose to treat him not as an enemy, but as a doctor. And that choice, made by American physicians, nurses, and administrators, changed more than one life. It echoed into the future, reshaping how generations of doctors thought about care, duty, and humanity. We often imagine war in terms of battles and flags, heroes and villains. But sometimes the most profound victories happen in the quiet corners of a makeshift infirmary, where one man holds a scalpel not in defense of a country, but in service of life itself. Dr. Reinhardt's life reminds us that being a physician means more than possessing skill. It means choosing integrity when it's inconvenient, compassion when it's undeserved, and hope when the world offers none. In the end, war could not define him. Politics could not own him. Captivity could not break him, because he chose a higher oath, the one that binds every true healer across borders and across time. And now, as you reflect on this story, consider what it means to carry that same commitment forward. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, because history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. Thank you for watching.